Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Simple Immersive English Podcast. My name is Kate, and I will be your host on this podcast. So, what are we going to do on the very first episode of this very new podcast? First, I wanted to take a chance to introduce myself to all of you and to explain what this podcast is going to be about, so you can decide if you would like to keep listening, which I really hope you do. So, I've been thinking about making this podcast for a few months now, but the inspiration, the way I got the idea to make this podcast, began about 2 years ago when I started listening to a podcast. I still remember in maybe 2021, I was a sophomore in university. Sophomore means the second year. I was a second year student at university. And in the United States, where I'm from, in the third year of university, students are given the opportunity to study in another country, and we call that studying abroad. So, as a sophomore, I was thinking to myself, I really would like to go abroad, but the problem was that because of the pandemic, I had only spent one semester at my current university, because before then, I had gone to a different one. So I had transferred, I had changed schools after my first year, and then only spent one semester. A semester is a half a year in the school year. I had only spent about 4 months or so at my university. So when I was thinking about whether or not I wanted to go to a different university in my third year, eventually I decided it would probably be best if I stayed at my current school so that I could build some more community and meet some more people and really take advantage of everything that my current school had to offer at the time. So in the end, even though I bet it would have been amazing, I decided not to do study abroad. But I still was curious, and I still wanted to learn about some other languages and some other cultures, which is why I had wanted to do study abroad in the first place. And when I was thinking about studying abroad, I had pretty much decided that I had wanted to go to study in Sweden, because I had been interested in learning more about Sweden. I had seen some information about Sweden, about their social structures, and about their society, some of their traditions, and of course their beautiful nature. I was really attracted to the rivers and the beautiful forests that I've seen pictures of, and also some of their cities, which seem really cool. So I had thought to myself that I wanted to go and experience that. And in the back of my mind, I had always also been interested in learning Swedish because I didn't know much about it, and I thought, from what I had heard, it sounded like a pretty cool language. So, since I was not going to actually go to Sweden, I decided that actually it happened while I was still deciding whether or not I wanted to go to Sweden. I decided I should probably get a little bit more familiar with the language of Swedish if I was going to go, because I really like learning languages, and one of the main reasons I wanted to do study abroad was to learn a new language. So I thought, before I go, maybe I should try to learn a little bit of Swedish myself, so that I can decide if I'm interested in going to Sweden, which I already thought I was, but also so that I could get a bit of a head start, so that I could learn a little bit of the language before I got to the country. I had studied other languages before, in school and on my own, and previously I had read grammar books and things like that to study a language. And while I think that is helpful, for this exploration of Swedish, I didn't want to do anything so formal. I just kind of wanted to get a sense of what the language sounded like and how I might actually use it in everyday life. Because sometimes I've found that when you study language books with grammar and stuff like that, you can start to get a very correct sort of understanding of a language. But then sometimes, after you think you know some stuff, you go out into the world and try to actually speak to someone, and you realize they speak in a way that's quite different from what is in the book, because it's more informal, it's more friendly, and it has slang, which is the casual words that don't sometimes appear in these sorts of academic books. So I thought, I think I'm going to watch a TV show in Swedish, because then I'll get to understand a little bit more about the culture, and I'll get to listen to the language while I'm enjoying a great story. So, I found a Swedish TV show on Netflix. I think I literally just searched Swedish TV, and I found a show called Bonus Family. And I started to watch this show, and I think at first I started to watch it with English subtitles, so that the characters on the TV were speaking in Swedish, but I was reading the English subtitles underneath that. And through that process, I started to get some input in Swedish. I started to get used to what the sound of Swedish was. And then, at some point, in that TV show watching process, I think I decided I wasn't going to do study abroad, but I had started to really enjoy the show, so I kept watching just for entertainment, and because I thought it was pretty fun just to watch a show in Swedish and start to listen to what Swedish actually sounded like, which it turns out I really enjoyed. I really like the sound of Swedish because it sounds so fun, and I love the intonation. Intonation is the sound that people make throughout the sentence. Like if it goes na 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 na, like that sort of thing. And I found that it was a little bit different from the intonation of English, and it was just very fun to me. So I kept watching the show. And then, little by little, slowly, I realized that I was starting to pick up on certain words that were in the show. And I thought to myself, what would happen if I switched the subtitles from English to Swedish, so that instead of listening to Swedish and reading English, I was listening to Swedish and also reading the Swedish. So that's what I did. After I had a foothold into the story, and what I mean by that is after I understood the basics of the story, so I knew who the characters were, I knew what some of their problems were, I switched the subtitles. I didn't rewatch the episodes. I kept watching the show, but instead of English subtitles, I put Swedish subtitles. And at first, I, somewhat obviously, didn't really understand what was happening. But, I kept watching the show, and I could follow I don't know if it was by watching it or by picking out a few little words that might be the same in English and Swedish. I got the gist of what was happening. And the gist is a word that means you can understand basically what's happening. You don't know exactly. You couldn't say, this character said exactly this right now, but you understand broadly and generally what's going on. So that is how I started. And as that was progressing, while I kept watching the show, I got pretty excited by how I was starting to actually understand a little bit more every time I watched an episode. Just a little bit, but it was pretty exciting that I could actually watch a TV show in a language that I had never really officially studied and understand a little bit of what was going on. And I think maybe this has something to do with the fact that English and Swedish are pretty similar languages. So I'm not sure if the process would have been so quick with a different language. Like, I've also studied Japanese, and when I think about if I would have been able to understand as much as I did with the Swedish show when I first started out with Japanese as well, I think it might have been more difficult because there are fewer words that sound the same. And also, of course, it would have been harder for me to read the subtitles. because Japanese uses a different alphabet. And English and Swedish use the same one, so it was very easy to read right from the start. But anyway, I was getting a little bit excited about this sort of different way of studying Swedish and also the Swedish language itself. So I thought, what would happen if I took away the visuals so that I really had to force myself to listen to the language itself, rather than being distracted and also helped by what the characters were doing on the TV screen. So then, I had the idea that I was going to start to listen to a podcast. And when I first went searching for a podcast, I expected to get one of those podcasts where there's a conversation or something in Swedish, and then the hosts, the people who run the podcast, I thought that they might translate it into English and explain in English what the Swedish was saying. That's the sort of thing I expected I might find and listen to. But when I searched for Swedish podcasts on Spotify, luckily I found a podcast called the Simple Swedish Podcast. And when I listened to it, I found that the entire podcast was only in Swedish. There was hardly any English, basically no English at all, maybe one word translated. But essentially, it was completely in Swedish. And even more shockingly, I found that when I listened to an episode of this podcast, there was a lot that I did not understand. And yet, at the end of the podcast, I still had some idea of what had been said in the podcast. And I remember being so amazed and so excited by that. And from that point on, I started listening to this podcast very regularly, and luckily there were a lot of episodes available. So I kept listening and listening and listening, and it wasn't something that I realized was happening in the moment, but looking back over the months, I see I learned so much from listening to that podcast, and it was really fun. And if any of you want to learn Swedish, I wholeheartedly recommend the Simple Swedish Podcast. It's so amazing. And 2 years later, that podcast has inspired me to make my own podcast, which is this, the Simple Immersive English Podcast. Now, why have I called this podcast the Simple Immersive English Podcast? Well, I wanted the name to be very, very clear for all of you, and for anyone else who might be searching for a podcast like this. I know that there are probably a lot of English podcasts out there, and certainly there are a lot of podcasts in English, but this podcast is specifically for those of you who are at an intermediate sort of level, a level in the middle, and those of you who are looking specifically to improve your listening skills, which I think can be one of the most difficult things to work on through a traditional study approach. And when I say traditional, I mean the sort of school study with books and writing out vocabulary, memorizing, that sort of thing. That's not what this is. This is a podcast where I hope something happens to you like what happened to me with learning Swedish and listening to the Simple Swedish Podcast. But for you, of course, in English. Now, the second word in the title, I think, is very important, and that word is immersive. The word immersion is sort of like when you put something in water and it goes all the way under. That's what immersion means. It's kind of like you're fully putting yourself into something. And in the context of language, it means when something is completely in the target language, the language you are trying to learn. And I think this is the best way to learn a language. It's going to feel very different from the way languages are sometimes taught in schools or through books, because it's not really a process that you can control as much. It's sort of like learning language as if you were a child, and how you learned your first language, because you didn't sit down to study or memorize or any of that. You just listen and listen and listen, and slowly something in your brain starts to recognize the sounds and put meaning to them, and you start to build up an understanding and a sort of feeling for how that language works. And I think that is something that's firstly so cool, but secondly, and perhaps more importantly for you, something that can really teach you a language in a way that you can actually understand people, like real people in the streets that you might want to talk to, or online or anything. And also, it can help you develop an internal understanding of the language, which will make it much easier for you to speak. And I want to say, my experience with learning a language through immersion has been that it really helps with understanding. You can really understand what other people are saying, but sometimes it is still a little bit difficult to speak because, especially learning with a podcast or TV or something like that, all you're doing is listening, and that gets really good. And of course, you do have some sense of how to say those things yourself, but alongside immersion, if you truly want to be able to speak as well, I would recommend, after you build up some familiarity and comfort with listening and understanding other people, eventually you will have to practice speaking yourself. So that's one caveat. A caveat is like a point or an idea that you do have to clarify and point out to people. It's sort of like, oh yes, all this is true, but remember, this is also something you need to remember. So that's all I wanted to say about that. But along with immersion, we have Simple, the Simple Immersive English Podcast. Now, when I say simple, this word does show the direct influence I had from the Simple Swedish podcast. And like that podcast, I say simple not because I'm talking about simple things, but because I'm speaking a little bit more slowly, just a little bit more slowly, and I'm trying to enunciate a little bit more clearly so that it's a little bit easier for those of you who might be starting out with listening. So, that's the title, and those are pretty much the only rules I have for this podcast. It will be in English. It will be aimed at people who might not be comfortable or able to listen to very fast English at the moment. So it's aimed at listeners who want to improve their listening skills. And hopefully we can make an environment where you can do that. But besides that, what I wanted to say is that we will be talking about so many different topics. And I hope that while you're learning English, we can also talk about some things that are interesting, regardless of the language, things that maybe you would want to learn about or think about when you weren't learning English, so that learning English becomes a way of exploring ideas, learning more about the world, listening to interesting stories, those sorts of things, which I think ultimately is the reason why we learn languages in the first place. So, I want you to get excited about that because I certainly am excited myself. I will be your host every episode, but on some episodes, I will also bring on some special guests so that we can hear English conversations and you can practice listening to more than one person at a time. So I think that might be enough for this first episode. I just wanted to explain to you all a bit about the inspiration, why I'm making this podcast, and a little bit about what you can expect from this podcast. And I hope to see you next time. But for now, I have been Kate, your host, and you are very, very, very welcome to the Simple Immersion English podcast. I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.